Welcome back. We are now on round 5 of the Indian Debating League's Sofia World's motion breakdown series, where we're going to be breaking down the motions and analyzing their burdens, along with ideas for cases from all the end rounds of Sofia World's 2026. My name is Krishaang. I will be conducting this session, if you can call it a session. And today we're going to jump right into it. The one thing that I want to note before we really get into the nitty-gritties of this motion is that I won't be making a case yet again. The more interesting thing that, or I think maybe the more useful thing that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be again giving you an idea of the binary, and I will help you identify the questions that you need to ask yourself when you're debating a narratives motion. Of course, these questions are non-exhaustive, which means that there are probably many more questions that can be asked. I also think that there is some overlap between the questions that I've already come up with, which is fine in my opinion, because when you eliminate that overlap, that's where you get nuance. But we're going to start. So narrative motions are usually motions of a THS or a THO type. They can even be a THBT, THR type. But there's one thing that's very important about narrative motions, which is that you're usually trying to debate the impact of a certain belief in society or a certain narrative in society. Sometimes, and this is something that's becoming more and more common as time goes on, you're not actually debating the narrative itself, but you're going to be debating the narrative in a specific type of way, whether that narrative has risen or fallen, whether that narrative has gotten popularized, whether the narrative has to do with glorification, pedestalization, fetishization, all of these other Asians type of words. This is a condition that is placed onto the narrative. How do we analyze this condition and how do we then debate this motion is what we're going to cover. So without further ado, let's get into the motion for today. So Infoslide. Social justice speak refers to the growing use of academic and activist terms about structural oppression and social inequality in everyday conversations outside academic or activist settings. So there's something that the Infoslide has already given us, which is that this motion doesn't have to do with all mentions of structural oppression and social inequality, but only to do with when these terms are brought up in everyday conversations outside academic or activist settings. Often there will be teams that will try to push the burden onto you that, this narrative is really important in these academic settings and getting rid of it is going to harm the quality of academia or activism and stuff like that. While those arguments might work if they're linked back well enough, in a vacuum, those arguments are not a relevant part of this debate. Let's continue. Examples include, but are not limited to, terms like mansplaining, white privilege, microaggressions, and intersectionality. Ideally, also, one thing that I do want to say for those of you that might be a little more novice or ESL, EFL, etc., people like me basically, but it is very useful to know the meanings of these words in colloquial language. What do we mean by mansplaining? And when is someone actually accused of mansplaining? What is white privilege? What is a microaggression? What is intersectionality? These are terms that will constantly keep coming up in social justice movements related motions, but they will also keep coming up in motions that are to do with narratives and stuff like that. So knowing the meaning of these terms is quite useful. If you don't, what should we do? We've covered this in previous sessions. Ask CAP. Ask CAP to at least give you a dictionary definition of any term that you don't know. You do not want to go and lose a debate because you just did not know enough. You might even lose some IR rounds like that, even though I've already explained how we can account for our lack of spec in these IR rounds. But you should not be using these types of rounds where spec really takes a backseat to your ability to be able to make good logical arguments and your ability to just be able to see the world around you, see the various microcosms and bubbles around you, and analyze how people behave, how people treat each other. Anyway, I think I'm going on a bit of a tangent. The info slide is done. Let's go to the motion. The motion reads, this house opposes the popularization of social justice speak. What is important? I hope that all of the stuff that we've talked about has already given you a hint that the main word here is popularization. Popularization. this is the key word that is going to help us make case, but it is also the key word which restricts the space within which this debate can occur. When we talk about framing, and again, a good intuition that I like to give people for framing is framing does not just mean giving arbitrary random information related to the motion or your arguments, but the purpose of strategic framing is to reduce not to reduce, but to set clear boundaries as to where this debate actually has to take place. Like the most reductive way that I can explain this is that your framing should always be similar to a picture frame. First, you make a picture frame, like a regular frame that you might have for any painting or a picture or something like that, like a frame. And that dictates the size of the potential picture that you're going to be able to put into. You might try to put a different picture into it. Your siblings or your friends might try to put a different picture into it. And in debate, you and the other teams are going to try to put different stuff into that picture, into that frame. But the goal of framing is to restrict the debate to a certain space. And this popularization helps us to kind of understand what the framing of this debate specifically needs to be. What we're going to do today is, as I already mentioned, I'm not necessarily going to be going very, very deep into my thoughts on what your case can be, what the winning OG is, what a winning OO is, blah, 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 blah. As opposed to that, I'm going to help you come up with the right sorts of questions that we ask ourselves in these specific types of narrative motions. So let's come to the burdens first. There are two very simple things that you need to pay attention to when you're debating a THO motion. A THO motion, which is shorthand for this house opposes, is generally a harms versus benefits debate. If we go back to the motion for a second, the burden that this motion places on proposition, this house opposes, where prop must defend this motion, is to oppose the popularization of whatever. And the reason that that prop can give to oppose this popularization, in the simplest words, is harms. If proposition is able to prove that there are a certain amount of harms that result from this popularization, that's fulfilling their burden. Op is trying to defend this popularization and is trying to prove benefits while also proving that these harms don't work, or trying to outweigh those harms with these benefits. One thing that I want to make very, very clear when we talk about motion burdens is this is maybe a more elementary way to understand the motion burden. That yes, of course, it's a THO motion, so you should be doing harms versus benefits debating. But it is very important to keep in mind what the bare minimum is. Because look, if we view debates like a utilitarian equation, okay, where if you're trying to prove positive or if you're trying to prove benefits, then the sign that you would attach to that benefit would be a plus, and the magnitude of that benefit is something that you're going to try to prove and weigh as to why it's something that's really big. Similarly, a harm is going to have a minus sign. At the end of the debate, when you add up all of the benefits and you subtract all of the harms, you're going to be left with something that might be a benefit or might be a harm. It might be something big, it might be something small. Lots of different benefits can, like, often it can be the case that there is one very big harm, but the other team has like 10 different small benefits that they're able to add together and outweigh that harm. Sometimes what you can do is you can prove the inverse is true or whatever, but it is important to understand what is the absolute bare minimum that you need to accomplish in order to win the debate. For government in this type of motion, the minimum burden is to prove some harm in the debate calculus, which is to say that until the balance of utility ends in the negative, until the final number that I was talking about right here at the end of the debate, where you've added all the benefits and subtracted all the harms and all of that kind of stuff, the end utility balance has to end in the negative. If it doesn't, government can't win. If it is positive, opposition obviously wins. But also, if this sort of debate ends in net neutrality, opposition wins. If the final number that you come up with at the end of this calculation, an equation is the wrong word, but maybe this expression, this at the end of this expression, the final number that you come up with, if that number is 0, if everything in the debate washes everything else out, then side opposition wins this debate. And the reason for this is actually something quite simple. Government in most motions has a bigger burden than opposition. They are advantaged in certain other ways because the advantages that are given to them to compensate for this big burden is that government gets to set what the burden is. Government gets to define where this debate needs to occur. There are so many pages in the world's manual that just keep talking about how important it is for government to define stuff, for prime minister to define stuff, how that definition has to stand, how the adjudicators cannot violate government's definition if it is something that's reasonable and stuff. So Gov gets some compensatory benefits. But in exchange for those benefits, there is an additional burden that government needs to have, which is to completely defend the motion. When Gov needs to prove that we have to oppose the popularization of social justice speak, they need to necessarily explain why this is something that should only be opposed and nothing else. If opposition doesn't prove that we should support the popularization, but if opposition proves that we should be apathetic towards this popularization because it causes the same amount of harms as it does benefits, then opposition wins. While I'm saying all of this, there are two important caveats that you need to understand. First, this doesn't account for principled argumentation, or if you're trying to weigh your impacts on deontological metric, which means that if there is a principle that either team is able to prove, and they're able to prove that the principle is true and important and relevant and all of that stuff, in that case, this equation or this calculation is not as important, because principles, contrary to popular belief, don't always have to interact with practical arguments. They can be logically prior to practical arguments. They can, in fact, not compensate, but they can overcome the need for practical arguments on either side. But principles, of course, have a higher burden and are tougher to prove. This is the first caveat. The second caveat is, if you're opposition in a motion like this, my advice to you is not to just try to wash Gov and not provide any benefits of your own. I've explained to you what the bare minimum is, but even though the opposition bare minimum is lower than the Gov bare minimum, that does not mean that your bare minimum should be your goal. Your goal should be to exceed this bare minimum. If you're opposition, you should try your best to prove benefits, but at the end weighing, at the final the final reckoning of this entire debate, when you do try to figure out, okay, once everything's said and done, what stands, what falls, you can use a high amount of mitigation and you can reduce the impact or neutralize the impact of government's harms and then claim that you're winning the debate. So let's say I'm closing opposition, my team is closing opposition. At member, my goal should not be to try to prove that there are no harms, but there are also no benefits. I should be trying to prove some benefits, but I should try more to negate harms. But then when the opposition whip comes and gives their speech, of course, they need to first try to explain to the judge that we did provide benefits and those benefits are outweighing the harms. But if nothing else, then they need to explain to the judge that we provided enough benefits to neutralize the harms. Or here are 5 responses that neutralize these harms. And if I am able to do this, then you as the judge should give me the win and the motion should fall, because Gov has given no reason for you to believe that the motion should stand. So I wanted to get a little bit into this, the burdens of a THS and a THO motion, because of course, these are the simplest types of motions. You could say that they are a derivative of a THBT motion, which is true. I think pretty much every motion type is a derivative of a THBT motion, which makes THBT motions the most fundamental motions, but it doesn't necessarily make them the simplest motions. Because THBT motions and the truth value burden that exists on THBT motions, it adds a lot of like confusion and a lack of clarity, a lot of scope for teams to give metrics as to what is true and what is false. But in a THO THS, we usually believe that these are very simple motion types because it's just harms versus benefits. But how you weigh those harms against those benefits, what your end goal needs to be, but what is the bare minimum you need to do, you should be aware of both of these things. So once that's, I hope that's clear. Now we can go into the keyword and a bunch of different questions that arises out of this keyword. The keyword in this motion is popularization. This popularization implies a few things. Okay. The first thing that it implies is that there is still some social justice speak that is going to continue to exist on both sides. Because look, let's just quickly go back to the info slide and the motion. Where is the remaining social justice speak coming, even if the motion stands? The first place that there is still some social justice speak constantly going to happen is in these academic or activist settings. This motion does not directly impact the amount of social justice speak or the utility of social justice speaks in these settings. Of course, teams can give arguments as to how there's going to be follow-on impacts or trickle-down benefits or maybe social justice speak, the popularization of social justice speak outside of these settings is worsening the quality of interactions or improving the quality of interactions inside these settings as well. But what is important to note is that by default, this is probably something that still exists. The second thing that's important is because we said popularization, even in the absence of popularization, there is still going to be a certain amount of social justice speak, even outside of these academic settings. Even in the stuff that we're talking about here, which is everyday conversations, on like dinner table conversations, on dates, and in classes, and all of that stuff, in everyday regular human interaction, absent this popularization, you are still going to have a certain amount of social justice speak. Both of these things become important to note, because then you can characterize how much exists and what it is. What you should be doing is to explore how much social justice speak is going to exist in the absence of this popularization. What are the situations where this social justice speak is used, etc., etc., etc. So the simplest way that we can put this in somewhat mathematical terms is if we take x to be a variable, that just explains, that just denotes the quantity and extent of social justice speak. Gov is defending a world where there is still X social justice speak. Op is defending a world where there is X plus Y social justice speak, where this Y unit specifically comes from popularization. So I think that before you really start to make case and think about, oh, is social justice speak good or bad, and what are the impacts of social justice speak, you should first figure out what is the margin of social justice speak that actually changes in this debate. Next, popularization, and this is something that's maybe unique to popularization and not necessarily unique to the other isms and Asians that I was talking about earlier that exist in these kinds of narrative motions. But popularization implies that there was a spread of this narrative or the spread of this social justice speak in casual settings from a group that we can call G to a group that we can call G plus H. There is an additional group of people, whether this is one community or a variety of communities, or whether this is limited to one country, or whether it is limited or limited to a certain type of country, or whether this I don't know what this edge group could be. It could be literally anything. You could talk about people who just did not have this being a relevant part of their life, okay, and now they do because of popularization. So when you are explaining what the process of this popularization actually looks like, again, my advice, which has been my constant advice throughout this series, is not to jump to harms and benefits and then try to justify them post facto and then try to then link them to the motion. If you're intermediate or above intermediate at debating, and by self-identification, obviously, I don't care what other people think of you. I care about what you think of you. But if you're intermediate or above intermediate at the sport of debating, you should force yourself and have enough discipline to ask yourself who this edge group is. And you should try to define this edge group in a way that is strategic to your case. Like, if, for example, you are Gov, then you're going to try to say that this edge group is someone who did not require this social justice speak, or who is not going to benefit from the social justice speak. Even if G group is going to benefit, edge group is not going to benefit. And this is the way that we're going to try to characterize who this edge group is. But if you're opposition, where you're going to try to defend this popularization of social justice speak, you're going to have to kind of take a stance where the original social justice speak that used to exist pre-popularization in G group was insufficient. This edge group, whoever this edge group is someone or something or an entity or an organization or a group of people or blah, 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 blah. This edge group is someone who really, really required this popularization because they really, really require having social justice speak in their everyday life. And if you oppose it and you exclude them from being able to access the social justice speak, there will be harms that they will face. So what is Gov saying? Gov is saying that edge group is facing harms because of popularization. Op can say that they are benefiting from this popularization and they really needed this popularization. And slash or, Op can say that in the absence of popularization, this group is going to face a lot of harm. So what have we done here? We are just trying to create margins in these narrative motions. And again, I know that some people treat these to be very easy motions, but I also know that there are some hard motion debaters and stuff who have a bit of a phobia of narrative motions, you can view these motions quite procedurally and mathematically. And you can figure out first, before you get into your arguments, what this motion is actually covering and who is the group or what is the quantum of social justice peak that is actually changing in this motion. Let's come to the third thing then. The third thing to note is the process of popularization. Stuff does not just happen. Apart from quantum fluctuations, apart from the Big Bang, I mean, there's theories that there was an initiator of the Big Bang, but apart from quantum fluctuations, most things in our universe follow a chain of cause and effect. These causes can usually be attached to a causer, especially in narrative motions. If you want to be more complicated and you want to be more nuanced, then you have to understand that it is a cocktail of causers and a cocktail of various different things happening that together lead to this thing being popularized. But in the simplest terms, you should understand that there is someone or something that popularized this social justice speak. Once you have figured this out, and this is something that's just common to most narrative motions, most rise fall motions, you should ask yourself, who is behind this? It doesn't have to be one individual person. It doesn't even have to be a single organization. It can be accumulation of various organizations and various people. What you should try to do while you're framing this is you should try to analyze the various trends and events that led to propositions standing as it is in, not in status quo, but in this debate, or also in status quo. So what does this mean? This means that if you're not able to identify a specific actor who caused this, you should try to identify what have been, and in these kinds of cases, in these narrative motions, you should be evaluating the recent past. The recent past can look anything like can it look anything like anything from the past few months to the past few years, usually not before that. I would say for this kind of motion, maybe keep a cutoff at like 2020, 2021. Like COVID is usually a great cutoff because COVID led to many, many changes. But analyze the various trends and events that led to this popularization. Once you do this, you will understand that someone probably had incentive or a want to popularize this, and capacity, which is the ability to popularize this, which means that it is likely that if no one else, they are obviously benefiting from this. If you are side government and you're trying to say that this popularization is bad, then the person or the actor who is behind this popularization, who is getting this benefit out of this popularization, you should prove that these are people that don't deserve this benefit. And I'll come to this in a while. If you're opposition, then you can explain why they deserve it. Or even if edge group is not benefiting from this, these people are benefiting from this, which is a sneaky way to have a closing opposition extension. One last thing which I've mentioned in this third question is a reaction. Because in society, most narratives are not organic narratives. Most narratives are counter narratives or reactionary narratives to stuff that has already happened. Usually when society goes too extreme in one direction, whether that's in terms of social liberalism, whether it's in and social oppression, not oppression, but at least a more structured and hierarchical society, whether it is a complete economic liberalization versus complete economic, say, I don't know, like isolationism and segmented countries doing their own thing, trying to be on their own. Whenever there is one extreme thing that happens in society, the arrow of time usually makes this no longer be just a graph that is rising up, but more like a pendulum. When a pendulum is pulled very hard in one direction, it goes and goes towards the other direction. Which is why you should keep this in mind, and you should try to figure out whether this popularization is a reaction to something. Were there forces that were preventing the pre-existing social justice speak from like being as big as it could be, or were there outside forces that caused enough harm to society that necessitated the social justice speak becoming popularized and being used by by people every day? Now let's move on and let's come to the fourth question. And the fourth question that you should ask yourself is, what is the cost of this popularization? And this links directly with the third question. Because in the third question, we asked ourselves, who is behind this popularization? Now we can ask ourselves, if this specific thing had not been popularized, would the agents behind its popularization focus on some other narrative? Because if we have already analyzed that there is an actor or actors that had incentive and capacity to create this popularization. If let's say that there is someone who has a car who really just wants to drive, and there is a certain road that is now blocked off, which when you're opposing this is something that is blocked off in gov world, what would they have done? Would they have stopped their car and sat there? This is quite unlikely. What is more likely is that if you have a car and you have fuel in that car and you have enough energy in yourself to drive and you have enough incentive that you do want to get to a certain destination, you would probably take a different path. This is also something that we call comparative. And of course, comparative is a broader term, and a lot of these things can be comparative, and comparative is more of an adjective than a noun. But you should ask yourself, if they weren't able to access this road and weren't able to popularize social justice speak, what would they have done? Would they have focused on some other narrative? What would that narrative have been? And would that narrative be better or worse than the social justice speak narrative? Because these are people whoever the agents behind this popularization are, who don't just want social justice speak. It's a means to an end. They want this social justice speak to serve some sort of social utility in society. It might be negative, it might be positive, it might be selfish, it might be altruistic, but they are trying to use it as a means to an end. If they were deprived of this means, what other means would they try to access? Would they be able to access it as strongly as they were able to access this specific road, this means? And would that road or would that means be better or worse than this type of narrative, both in process and in impact? If you are able to think of these 4 questions, you probably are already able to come up with a variety of different clashes way beyond what is likely going to be explored in any traditional British parliamentary debate. In most British parliamentary debates, where relating to these narratives, to harms and benefits, it's usually just a mech battle, or who can push their impact the best. But what this is all going to help you do is identify what the impact is, how much of a difference there is in the impact, who wants this impact, who gave this impact, who is receiving this impact, and what would people have done otherwise. Last 2 questions. The 5th question here is, how long is this popularization going to keep growing? Because we know that we don't exist in a non-inertial world. Even light, I mean, yeah, but like even light, when it travels over very long distances, ends up shifting its wavelength, ends up losing a certain amount of energy. And this is even more true for narratives. Nothing lasts forever. The social justice speak as a concept might last forever. I don't think it will, though. But what we need to analyze for the purpose of this debate is the duration and the temporality of this specific narrative. So let's say that this popularization came from somewhere, right? Someone or something did this. It spread to a specific group, this edge group that did not used to have this earlier. Now we are going to try to think that if this narrative came from somewhere, if this narrative is a child of someone, then is this narrative also going to create more children? Are there going to be different variations of this narrative that might continue to exist? So you should always be thinking about, even if let's say you're opposition and you're trying to say that this narrative is something that's good, and Gov has given you a million reasons to believe that it's not that good, opposition can explain that maybe it is not that good, but this popularization of SJS was a necessary catalyst or a necessary intermediary between what used to exist and the next narrative that's going to come. And if we are able to prove that this is the unique way that this next good narrative can come, then we can still try to win the debate from opposition. If you are government, you can say that sure, maybe this narrative is doing a certain amount of good right now, but it is giving a lot of credence, a lot of credibility, and a lot of power to other actors who are going to misuse or hijack this narrative to lead to more negative things happening in society, worse versions of this narrative that will start under the umbrella of this specific narrative. So you should think about what the impacts of this narrative are going to be, not just in terms of the direct impacts onto people, but in terms of the impact of this narrative onto other narratives, onto the creation or the strengthening or the weakening of other narratives. Think of impacts this way. It will always be useful for you to be able to at least avoid the meg battle debate that it ends up being when you just have harms and benefits. Last question. I think it's a bit of an overlap, but I think it's something of a repeat of the first 3 questions, but it's a very simple way to put it. If you don't want to do any of this maths, you should just ask yourself these 2 things. Who benefits from this? do they deserve to benefit from this? You can answer this question in yes or no on both sides. Not this question, this question. You can identify a stakeholder on both sides, and you can answer this second question in a yes or a no on both sides. For example, if we are Gov, we can concede that there are people who benefit from this, but we can say that they don't deserve to benefit from this. If we are opposition, we can say that there are certain people who don't benefit from this, but that's okay because they don't deserve to benefit from this anyway. And here are the people that do benefit from this and do also deserve to benefit from this, whatever. If you make like a PNC table, you'll be able to come up with a variety of different stakeholders on all sorts of on all spectrums of the moral alignment chart, on all spectrums, or like anywhere on the spectrum of vulnerability, or anywhere on the spectrum of poverty, of oppression, of power, all of these things. You can find people along the spectrum. You can find groups along the spectrum. You can identify whether they benefit or not and whether they deserve to benefit or not. Once you've done all of this, which should ideally take you maybe, I don't know, 8, 9, 10, 12 minutes of your case prep, you should try to list what are the harms and benefits. And it might seem a little intimidating that, oh, I have such little time to actually fulfill the burden of this motion, which is the harm and the benefit, and weigh out the harm and the benefit. But if you will notice, by virtue of answering all of these questions, we're doing two things for ourselves. The first thing that we're doing is we're already kind of hinting towards what the harm and benefit is going to be. So one approach would be to immediately jump into case prep and try to think of harms and benefits. But the second approach would be, when you are following all of these steps and asking yourself all of these questions, you're going to just keep thinking of more and more dimensions to this motion, and you're going to keep thinking of various harms and benefits. I just want you to keep them on the back burner until the end. But the second benefit that it has, but the second benefit that delaying your impact identification has is that before you've identified your impact, you've identified the entire space zone relevance coverage of that impact, which means that later on, it will be very easy to do two things. The first, it will be very easy to weigh your impact. It will be very easy to explain why this impact is important, whether because of the edge group, whether because it's there's some that's still on both sides, whether it's because of the person who or the actors who push this narrative or whatever. You'll be able to find a variety of different lines of weighing. But the second benefit is that you've found how to place this impact before you even came up with this impact. So you know exactly how it fits into the debate. If you do this, you will reduce the amount of legwork that you need to do to actually engage with the impacts of other teams. They might give you like an endless list of impacts. They might give you very, very strong proof for their impacts. But if you've done all of this framing, you will be able to push out all of those impacts, or at least most of these impacts, from what the debate is. You don't have to prove that their impacts are incorrect. You just have to prove that they're not actually debating the motion when they provide those impacts. So if nothing else, you will end up winning over a bunch of different teams just on the metric of relevance. One additional thing here is that if you're doing all of this stuff in prep, you are already imbibing a certain amount of nuance, or ingraining, or some other better word than that, a certain amount of nuance into your case and into your impacts that other teams might lack. So this is also very useful for you to be able to find extension, which is, even if one team proves an impact, let's say we're closing government and opening government is fantastic, is very fast. I don't know. Opening government is Matt Cato and Hamza Tariq Chaudhry. I don't know. So even if that happens and they have burned a lot of content and they've gone through a bunch of different things, you can still enter the debate without necessarily rebutting them, avoiding knifing, by just explaining that maybe a lot of what they said is not relevant, or maybe a lot of the mitigation or a lot of attacks that the other teams may have against them might be valid, absent the explanation of relevance, or they have not like really unlocked their impact because they've not explained the key stakeholders who get this impact, or they've not explained who needs this impact, or they've not accepted the trade-off of the harms that this is going to cause. But we still have a case because we are able to justify that this is going to lead to, I don't know, like some different narrative that might be better, might be worse, whatever. Not harms, benefits, like something like that. So the idea is that even if your opening team is very matter dumpy and very good debaters who know a lot about the world and who know a lot about debating, you are still going to be able to at least eke out a certain amount of space for yourself in this debate and end up providing unique contributions without those contributions being derivative, without them being knifey, and without those contributions being irrelevant. So the metric of relevance ends up becoming super, super important in these narrative motions, especially in British parliamentary debate. The last thing that I want to cover before we conclude this session is on trade-offs. There are always going to, like, look, we're always debating against three other teams, and I mean, it might be a little bit egotistical for me to say this as someone who does debate, but I do think that, and I think this is widely accepted consensus, that debating is a sport that ends up selecting the top certain percentage of smart people from any group. Like, it might be a college, it might be an institution, whatever. It's usually likely that the IQ is a flawed term, but just for the sake of argument, the average IQ of debaters in any debating society is probably going to be more than the average IQ of people not in this debating society. Of course, this is something that can be untrue in many cases. There can be edge cases or whatever. There can be people who think they're too good for debating, and many of them actually are, and people who are scammy and hacky and just keep debating without actually being good. All of this is true, but you need to be charitable enough to your opponent to understand that they're basically coming from the same group of people that you are, and therefore it is extremely unlikely that nothing they say is making sense. It is extremely unlikely that if they've spent 15 minutes thinking of harms, benefits, thinking of framing, thinking of impacts and stuff, and they put all of that in the debate, but you came up with a very clever response, you should always be a little bit skeptical about the strength of your response, and you should give your opponents the benefit of the doubt and understand that they are smart enough and they do probably know enough about the world to not be speaking gibberish for 15 minutes. Therefore, there are a certain amount of harms or a certain amount of benefits that are being pushed by the other team that are true in the debate. And it is often very difficult, especially if those are very intuitive harms and benefits. It is often very difficult to try to beat those harms and benefits just with responses. We often think, especially a lot of us who might enjoy the analytical or rigorous or abstract or like the more verbal chess element of debate, we often end up thinking that there's no claim that is unrespondable. And if we provide enough proof and we give a strong enough response, and the response is well enough targeted, and if the response is placed well, executed well, we're going to be able to prove to the judges that you shouldn't buy their claim. But often these claims are just kind of real, and even your best responses just kind of work as mitigation, which is why sometimes you will, even after hearing OAs by judges, you will feel like, oh, this is so unfair that on the short cross, opening opposition's material was bought. Even though I gave 5 responses, all of them that I think are really strong, why did the judge think that there is still something that's existing on their side? And you will get more and more, because I know I've been through this, you will get more and more frustrated with yourself, thinking about, oh, like maybe the sport isn't for me, like, or maybe judges are stupid, or everyone is stupid, like I am this, I am that, blah blah blah. I don't think this is a very strategic way to debate. I think the more strategic way to debate is to be charitable and to accept the most obvious, the most well proven harms and benefits that the other team has. As long as you're able to prove that they're not debate winning, as long as you can outweigh them, as long as you are, if you can't flip them, that at least you can mitigate them to a certain extent, that the judge might buy the intuitive quality of the harm or the benefit, but maybe you can convince the judge that this harm isn't as harmful as the judge thinks it is, or it isn't as beneficial as the judge thinks it is, or it doesn't harm or benefit as many people as the judge thinks it does. If you're able to do some of this mitigation, good, but you should at the end of the day accept for a moment that these things can stand, that your opponents are somewhat right, and then you should attempt to outweigh them either by pushing them out of the motion, either by providing a bigger harm or benefit, or as I've tried to explain in the session, a more relevant harm or a benefit, something that actually changes in this debate. One example of how to do this is, let's say I'm closing government. Let's say opening opposition was able to explain that this narrative has a lot of benefits. Let's say they give 3 benefits. It doesn't matter what those benefits are. Let's say they just gave 3 benefits. I don't necessarily have to beat every benefit that opening opposition gives. I can use strategy 1 and say that this and X amount of social justice speak is still going to exist on our side. So the benefits that opening opposition is claiming in this round are still going to keep accruing to the quantity that is like X, whatever the quantity of social justice speak is. You can also say that G group is still going to keep benefiting from social justice speak, and every benefit that opposition has talked about, these are true benefits that exist from pre-existing social justice speak. If you do this, you're not necessarily convincing the judge that there is no benefit. You're convincing them that this benefit isn't arising as a product of this motion. This is an easier thing for judges to buy as compared to buying that there is no benefit or there is no harm. Once you've done this, then you can go deep on what this Y quantity of SJS is. You can go deep into what this H group is. And then, even while conceding certain benefits from op, you can explain why this H group is so asymmetrically harmed. You can explain that an X amount of SJS actually leads to benefits, but if you add too much SJS, it can lead to a bunch of harms as well, which are not exclusive, because on Gov you get all the benefits of SJS without the harms. You can do this kind of placing. You can concede to a certain amount of harms. Be charitable, think deeply, put yourself in a position where you're not going for the low hanging fruit of jumping for impacts. Use procedure, analyze the motion, then start impacts. And you will do very well in social justice rounds, but more specifically in these narrative rounds. All the best. See you next time.